can go. Okay, excellent. So, what's up, you scholars of enlightenment? Have you ever noticed, a question for you today, have you ever noticed that some sounds really have the ability to put you on edge? Perhaps the sounds of chewing, the sounds of breathing, the sounds of rustling. These seem to be some of the common ones. Well, if you have noticed that, you might not be alone, because in a recent published study, scientists have begun to unravel a condition known as misophonia, and have shown that some people's brains are actually hardwired to produce an excessive emotional response to certain trigger sounds. So to help us unravel this condition and the scientific underpinnings, we welcome Dr. Phillip Gander to the show. Dr. Gander, welcome, and thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Dr. Gander is an associate research science in the Department of Neuroscience at the University of Iowa, the Human Brain Research Laboratory, where he conducts research using intracranial recordings. Essentially, he's fascinated by how the brain converts sound into meaning and how this is critically dependent on a person's current state of mind and history. His research focuses in the area of auditory cognition, understanding how the brain makes sense of sound from a perspective of cognitive neuroscience. So, Dr. Gander, if we start sort of very zoomed out, what is misophonia?
So the term literally means hatred of sound. It's from the Greek miso and phonia.
Yep.
And that was a term coined in and around the year 2000 by a colleague of Pavel Yastrebov. And Pavel was observing this sort of unique disorder in his clinic and research, and wanted to come up with a particular term to describe these particular people that were reacting to a certain set of sounds in a very strongly negative way. And Pavel is mostly famous for describing a model of tinnitus. And so it was within this sort of tinnitus context that he also came across this other disorder.
Interesting. So are we talking with misophonia more a general annoyance of certain sounds, or should we draw a distinction between a general annoyance and a more neurological condition or maybe disorder, if that's not too strong a word to use in this case?
Right. No, I think disorder is an appropriate word. It's not meant to box people into a certain thing, but
Sure.
but it's I think it's just more generally as a neuroscientist in terms of talking an abnormal operation of the nervous system, essentially. It depends who you talk to about. And there's much fighting that goes on about whether or not misophonia, or it's also called selective sound sensitivity syndrome, or generally a decreased sound tolerance, it's whether or not it's a unique entity in and of itself, or whether it's a particular subcategory of something else like hyperacusis. A sort of an overreaction to sound. And my personal opinion, and I'll explain why, is that it is a unique entity. And that comes from our belief about what are the likely neural mechanisms. And in particular, hyperacusis, or a general sound tolerance decrease, is something when people, a lot of us experience this, actually. People will react strongly to, really loud sounds, or sometimes sounds that many of us seem are tolerable, maybe a bit loud, but tolerable. Someone with a sort of general hyperacusis will respond quite negatively to that sound in terms of either avoiding or wearing earplugs or things like this. So many of the behavioral manifestations are similar across these things, and so it kind of invites the idea of wanting to call it a single concept or a single thing, but I don't think so. And the reason is and much of our research that we'll talk about today, I think highlights this, is that hyperacusis or general sound tolerance issues are very much couched within the auditory system, and then connections from the auditory system to other brain systems that are mostly involved in your reaction to that experience. And this also sort of tinnitus also falls into this sort of category. So I study that a lot as well.
So it sounded in this research that it was sort of linking those auditory systems to the sort of fight or flight mechanism, if that's not too coarse of a way to put it.
So that's right. You're moving it along right. So in the case of misophonia, if we're just going to call it that for today, then its system seems to be lying elsewhere, and the auditory system is brought on board because sounds happen to be a particular stimulus or trigger, as it's called, that sets off the reaction. But we also know that just seeing some of certain events can also trigger a reaction in some people as well. And so it doesn't seem to be germane to just the auditory system. And when in our brain recordings, there's much going on beyond the auditory system. And in fact, the auditory system itself wasn't a principal player in our initial study of looking at people's reactions to trigger sounds.
I think of, or what springs to mind with me, I had some issues with this earlier in life, of kind of intrusive thoughts where you'll see a certain thing or it makes you think in a certain way, and that triggers off the fight or flight where there's not necessarily a danger that's commensurate with the thing you've seen or what's going on or the sound that's happening. So it seems that perhaps, and perhaps I'm going too far, I'm not an expert in this field, that maybe it comes under that sort of broader umbrella of certain triggers leading to a fight or flight mechanism where there doesn't necessarily need to be one, or most people wouldn't perceive one. Is that fair, or is that
no? I think you're right on there, and I think that's exactly the surprise, essentially, that we had with our initial study, is that it really was, and I'm glad you introduced the term, a fight or flight response was the reaction that people had to these particular trigger sounds, and literally. So I did a live radio interview one time, and that was, I don't know if you've ever done that. It's mildly stressful.
I have done one, and I don't know what a nice way to say is that I very much messed it up, because it's you don't get a chance like this where I have great control and a chance to edit and friendly subscribers and this kind of thing. So it was like you're on.
So I was really lucky that the producer must have filtered out the crazies, as it were, and there were really excellent questions and really excellent people coming on and asking great questions about misophonia, and one particular person really struck a chord with me, because they were describing how their life had essentially been turned upside down, and they were having real trouble at home because they essentially couldn't be around their family anymore, because mostly eating, I think, and other sounds that family members were making was intolerable to this person, and they just couldn't be around, and that was causing obvious distress in the family.
Are there certain sounds that come up again and again in this field that tend to be the trigger sounds? You mentioned eating, breathing, those kind of sounds. Are there other ones that seem to be ones that come up again and again?
A very common ones seem to be sort of mouth-related sounds, and that can be in the sort of genre of eating, but also in breathing, and so sort of like sniffing or snuffling sounds, or lip smacking. And we're making all these sounds all the time. And
I was going to say, when you link that back to being able to operate in the real world, that's not something that you might run across once in a blue moon. That's something that is integral to operating in the world.
Yeah. And so it has obvious impacts on people's ability to work, depending on the degree of severity. And as just an aside, I think the the severity of people's reactions to these trigger events is something I think that we need to dig into more in the field. And I don't think that's, at least I haven't personally appreciated how much that probably really matters, because I have colleagues who, they would be described as having misophonia, but they get along and do their work, and they're neuroscientists and things like this. They cope or they manage. So I imagine that they are on a less severe end of distress from these trigger events than other people, like that person I spoke to on the radio. So
it seems like the word you're driving at is sort of spectrum. Some people are sort of worse on it, and some people are maybe not so bad. And maybe that, I don't know if is it fair to say, because a lot of people, seem to have an aversion to some of these sounds, but maybe sometimes their aversion is more, someone's rustling popcorn in the movie theater, or they're chewing really loudly. There's more of a trigger that's distracting to the movie, or it's it's just inconsiderate of that person. And it seems that there's a line between that and an actual neurological condition where it becomes more out of hand, more sort of acute, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, I might want to throw popcorn at that person's head to tell them to shut up. But someone who suffers from misophonia is going to start to get sweaty palms. Their heart rate's going to increase, and certain areas of their brain are going to go into overdrive, and that's going to lead them to need to do something about that very strong physiological reaction. And that either needs to be that they need to go up and punch that person in the face, or they have to get out of the movie theater.
Take themselves out of that situation.
Yeah, and that is literally, right? That's the thing that was really interesting about this radio show as well, and other people I've spoken to, is they literally, without using the words fight or flight, they literally described a fight or flight thought process.
Yeah, the two options were literally there. Yeah,
hit the person or I need to walk out. And so the socially acceptable thing, obviously, is to get out of there.
Yeah,
and that's, I think, what people are doing in many cases, and hence the whole issues with respect to isolation, social isolation, and other aspects, which of course are going to come with problems in the workplace and at home, etc.
That's kind of a nice segue into the next question I had. That how common is this condition, and when did we become aware of it? Is it potentially underdiagnosed? Because, as you said, that the sort of socially acceptable thing is to say, oh, I just really can't put up with it. It must be something wrong with me. I'll just, take myself away and deal with it. Is that a problem?
It is a major issue. That if that is the primary response, then you could imagine why so many people would never have really brought this up with their doctor or whatever. And obviously this has existed for a long time, arguably ever since we've been social creatures. So it's not that it just first started appearing or existing in our minds in the year 2000.
As soon as the scientists found it sort of popped into
but it I think we need to give some amount of thanks there, because it really brought it into the forefront that of our minds, and the research community, to really start talking about this. And the medical community is largely ignorant of this disorder, and that's not surprising, because it's as we say, it's barely ever being brought up to them. And the scientists like me know almost nothing about it, to be fair. And in terms of prevalence, that's really difficult to say, right? Because we haven't really defined the thing. Then to say how common it is difficult. Nevertheless, we think it can range as high. I mean, one of the initial studies was in an undergraduate population, a sort of questionnaire-based form of answering, how do you react to these types of events. It was as high as around 20%, which was possibly an overestimate, depending on how specific the questions were. A good colleague of mine in the UK did a more recent survey of, I believe, medical students in the UK, a large-scale study, and he found that mild symptoms were as high as 50% of the population, and then sort of moderate symptoms were considerably less, around 10%, and really severe symptoms, so the people that are having these very aversive reactions, was very low. I think it was less than 1%.
Still not vanishingly small though. 1 in 100. It's not particularly.
No. So 1%, 1% is still actually rather large, and I think that it definitely deserves our attention.
No, that's fair enough. So coming on to the actual results of the sort of research that you did, what is the best understanding from the science, from the neurological data, as to why people have this condition, and how did you determine that with the research?
So, again, that's hard. It's hard to say. I mean, the initial study that we did, if I gave just a bit of background for that, I guess, it was to ask people in the community who sort of self-diagnosed as having misophonia to come into the research center to have an MRI scan. And they listened to 3 sets of sounds, and this was really important to have this to dissociate it, sort of very specific reactions to a certain set of sounds, as opposed to sort of general annoyance that we all have to certain types of annoying or unpleasant sounds. So we had trigger sounds, and sort of the eating and chewing and breathing variety, and then generally annoying sounds, so like nails on a chalkboard, a baby cry, or things like this, and then sort of neutral sounds as sort of a baseline, so like footsteps perhaps, or rain or something like this.
So sort of like a control set of sounds.
That's right. And then, very importantly, we had a control group, right? So people who did not identify as having misophonia symptoms. And the reactions to the neutral sounds and the unpleasant sounds were the same between the 2 groups. And in the control group, the reaction to the trigger sounds was the same as the reaction to the unpleasant sounds for that group. So those sounds were unpleasant. And it was just very selectively, these trigger sounds for the misophonia group had a very strong overreaction in the brain. And in particular, this was in a region called the anterior insula, and also in other regions involved in memory, and also the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, sort of brain regions that are also involved in high-level sort of learning and memory and associations, but also brain regions that are involved in sort of our background, everyday monitoring, sort of self-reflective thought monitoring stuff. And it was and also really nicely, and that's what I said about the physiological response, again, very selectively to these trigger sounds, only the misophonia group had a dramatic increase in heart rate and sweating, or galvanic skin conductance response. So it was really nice set of results, right? Because it very cleanly showed that this particular set of sounds was, for a particular group, very creating a very strong reaction in the brain. And the anterior insula was interesting, because then again, it brought us outside of the auditory cortex, right? We might have thought, okay, it's the hearing parts of the brain that are really going crazy. But it was not that part of the brain. It really was a different region that's involved with sort of self-monitoring of sort of internal states. And this is brought up thoughts in our minds and moved us into the world of sort of interoception. I don't know if you've heard that term before. And so, interoception is our experience of basically our internal world, and perception is our experience of the external world. And, for thousands of years, Asian cultures have known about our interoception. It just really seems very slow in the Western world for our quote proving in neuroscience that this is an important thing and really controls a lot of our experience of our external and all of our world. And I think it's really gone underappreciated, and it's something that's starting to really emerge, I think, more as we understand more about how we work essentially.
And is there an understanding from the research as to sort of the mechanism that causes those areas to go into overdrive and link to that fight or flight? I saw in some of the research, or there were some of the sufferers in this article were mentioning it gets worse with things like caffeine, with things like alcohol, stimulants, perhaps drugs, perhaps. Is there any idea of what's causing that overdrive? Is it a defect in the brain? Is it a different wiring? Is there any insight behind that?
That's it's unclear at this point, and I think
it's always good for scientists to say we're not sure yet. That's always fine.
I mean, I guess I should stop starting every answer with that. So we don't really know.
No, it's perfectly fine.
I think, but I will talk about the clues that we have, of course. So one of the clues is, just a lot of people you ask, you say, oh, well, when did you start noticing this response?
Yeah.
And it's very common for people to say in childhood. And they will link it often to a particular event and or a particular person. So then usually in the family, that is the trigger. So father or mother or brother or sister or something like this, and a particular sound that they made that then expands sometimes to include that type of trigger sound or event, but for all of the people in the family or all of the people you work with. And so that immediately invites ideas about learning, and that this is
that makes it sound like a learned response rather than something that's innate or a defect in the brain that was there at birth, for example.
That's exactly right. I think that's right. Whether or not we want to talk about genetic predispositions or certain predispositions that you're born with, that's difficult to say. But definitely learning seems to be a strong aspect of what's going on here. And as well, as I mentioned before, one of the areas of the brain that we saw that seemed to be responsive to these particular sets of sounds was a brain region that's also involved in learning. And it is attractive to think that this is and other researchers have proposed this, that it's a sort of an associative learning. It's a learned response to a particular type of event that becomes sort of conditioned in terms of a response then that people have to these types of triggers.
And that sounds similar to issue. I bring it back to an issue I had with the intrusive thoughts. It came from a particular event, and then when you talk to someone, you're like, oh, it obviously came from there, and it was very silly. Or now when you think it through, it's like I didn't need to have that adverse reaction. That would seem to link it to other potentially learned behaviours and neurological issues.
Yeah. So the comorbidity of misophonia with a bunch of things has been related, but really, do we want to call it a psychiatric syndrome or disorder? I don't know if we're there yet necessarily. It's not formally described in any sort of psychiatric manual or definition system. I don't know if we're there yet necessarily. I think some of my colleagues who are psychiatrists might strongly argue that should be the case.
Yeah.
Whether or not then treatments that are offered for certain disorders that seem to have a lot of overlap, like obsessive compulsive disorders, that's still yet to be seen. Whether or not there's pharmacological interventions that way, or cognitive behavioral therapy has been offered up as a potential approach. These are initial thoughts, I think, that researchers are having, and it's unclear in terms of any real effective treatment as of yet, as well, unfortunately.
Fair enough. I was going to ask, it just sort of jumped out at me. I didn't prep this question with you earlier. Is there from your work, is there a wider mechanism that's understood in the brain of why we perceive some sounds to be sonorous, thinking about music, for example, and other sounds, you mentioned nails on a chalkboard, seem to be universally despised and hated by most people. Is there a known mechanism in the brain as to why we think that, or is it sort of a pattern seeking thing that something just sounds off with our normal experience of the world, like a discordant playing of a piano, for example?
Right. I think some answer to that we have as well, again, from my colleague Sukhbinder Kumar, who did a nice study where he played particular sort of classically aversive sounds and looked for the brain response, again, in the MRI scanner. And what he found was that these sounds that we all sort of found really particularly aversive had a particular makeup in terms of particular frequencies and sort of change or modulation rate. And the brain region that was very reactive was one that was not necessarily a surprise, which is the amygdala. And this brain region is often related very broadly, and possibly incorrectly, just as an emotional center. But it's definitely a brain region involved in sort of valence detection, so sort of positive and negative events. It responds very strongly to, among many other things. So that, notice I didn't mention the amygdala when we were talking about brain responses in misophonia. And so I think that, again, there's something different here going on, where there's particular sounds that we might all agree are unpleasant because of the particular way that they react within our auditory system, and then are sort of patterned in a certain way that makes certain parts of our brain, respond more strongly, like the amygdala. But the misophonia trigger sounds seem to be operating differently. And well, yeah, go ahead with your...
No, I was just going to say, so again, it's drawing a line between that general discomfort that most people have with some of these sounds and a more specific condition that operates in a different way in the brain.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this, I guess the reason why I'm talking to you right now is because the study that we had more recently actually moved it even more conclusively outside of the realm of the auditory system. Again, my colleague Sukhbinder, he took a group of people with misophonia and just did this sort of poor neuroscientists approach to measuring responses in the brain, which has become very popular. It's called resting state connectivity. So it's to use functional MRI imaging to look at what's going on in the brain at rest. And it's actually quite a lot is going on, and quite a lot in terms of very similarly patterned brain regions operating in a network. And what he found in the misophonia group, and again, not in the control group or significantly more strongly, was connectivity between the auditory system, but a brain region that was a surprise to us, which was the motor system. And the motor areas that were very strongly connected were, surprise, surprise, the orofacial motor movement regions. So that doesn't actually not surprising at all, right? When you think about it for a second, if the trigger sounds are often of the variety of orofacial that provide this type of response, then the areas of the brain that actually make our movements for these same brain regions and also represent our thoughts about moving these types of muscles in our body is really strongly connected. That might give us clues about what's going on in this disorder. And so the title of our paper was very ridiculous, but I think it was the motor basis for misophonia. And it really brought out a new appreciation, potentially, we hope, if it follows through with further work, that misophonia really seems to be something that might be related to our mirroring of actions of other people, and brought it into a completely different world of the way, a world for neuroscientists of the way we think about the body works, and maybe more of a motor hypothesis about our perception or our interaction with our world, that we represent what we see and what we hear and through our other senses by the actions that they represent and that they create in others or in ourselves.
So you're seeing and hearing somebody chewing or breathing, and you're thinking, how would that relate to me? How would I do that? How would I?
Yeah, I mean, the yawning example is great, right? I mean, that's the classic example of you see someone yawn, and then all of a sudden you start yawning, you feel you want to yawn. Yeah. I mean, that's a silly example, but it's a thing. It's definitely a thing that we know and observe, and so if it really is the case that the mirroring system in people with misophonia is sort of overreactive, it might be the case that they are having these very strong negative reactions because they are being their brain is essentially impulsively moving them to want to move that part of their body, or is trying to say, hey, you should be doing something with this part of your body now, without their control, right? Without their desire. And if you have someone else controlling your body, you're not going to be too happy about it.
That's not the best thing to be going on.
Yeah. So it brought up these ideas about a mirror neuron system, which was discovered in the late 1990s and early 2000s in monkeys, in which the animal would make a motor movement, a reaching response, and then when they saw another animal make that same response, the same neurons were firing in both conditions.
Interesting.
So we think there might be some links to this type of system here.
Very interesting. Is there anything you mentioned in the sounds that most people, not necessarily in misophonia, but just that most people find, not particularly nice, nails on a chalkboard? There's a particular sort of frequency spectrum, this kind of a certain modulation. Are there any clues of that type in the misophonia sounds? A lot of them seem to be very similar. You say that might be to do with mirroring, which makes sense if it's oral facial. Is there anything in that frequency spectrum and what type of sounds they are? Repetitive sounds,
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not looked explicitly, and maybe we should. I'm
just thinking a lot of them seem maybe unconscious, things like rustling, people do it without thinking, or breathing or chewing, the sort of things that are sort of done very unconsciously, very repetitive sounds. I don't know. I'm just throwing out things as a non-expert that sort of strike me as to how I can put them under one hat.
That's right. Although I think that some of the trigger sounds are more impulsive, right? So sort of like single events type of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas as you mentioned, that some of the other sounds might be repetitive in some way. So then there clearly is a modulation of that response, right? Someone's tapping away.
But that's just irritating anyway. If somebody's just tapping, just I can imagine my response to that.
But and I also want to make a comment about sort of comorbidities or other common occurrences that seem to be a thing. I don't know if you know about this internet sensation of this ASMR.
Yes, I was going to ask about this actually. Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. So I reviewed a paper about this, and I was mostly unawares, and I was like, hey, that's me. I have that response. And so basically the idea here is that it's this sort of spine tingling or prickling of the skin that you get to, again, particular events, usually but it is audio-visual again. But the distinct difference to misophonia is that it's not a negative reaction. It's often quite a positive reaction.
Yeah.
And so this study that I reviewed was just simply asking, is it the case that people with misophonia also happen to be ASMR responders, basically?
I was going to say, because the panpipes, the whale noises, the ocean, the rain on the roof, these classic ones that people seem to enjoy, or you could listen to, to fall asleep to. Do they have that same response, or are there another group of people who are, prophonia? I don't know what my best my best prefix would be.
I think it's both. Unfortunately, I think that there are definitely people who respond positively to these sounds and do not respond negatively to lip smacking or whatever. But then, of course, there are people who respond both positively and negatively to these particular sets of sounds. But there are other some colleagues that also recently published a paper in which in a large general population type of survey, a lot of people who happen to have or had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder also happen to have a higher correlation to the severity of their misophonia symptoms. And that might just be as a function of other comorbid reactions. So like anxiety is a particularly strong emotional response to these trigger events. And that is also going to be something that's common in people with PTSD for certain types of events.
I guess that would make sense when somebody was saying it was worse with coffee. I know when I've had a load of coffee, I'm on edge, I'm stressed. I'm more attuned to anything that might give me a negative reaction.
Yeah, I think many things have been tried and have failed to show relationships. I'm just thinking in particular, say, to tinnitus. So it's unclear to me as of yet whether or not that might be the case for misophonia. But you're right. If you set your body in motion for a particular, prime it into a particular type of state, it wouldn't be surprising to me at all that if you're all hopped up on whatever drug, that you are more inclined to respond positively or negatively to a particular trigger events, as it were.
That's fair.
And maybe that's just as a self-treatment type of approach. If you happen to notice, as you say, you're really bothered by that tapping person behind you right after you've had your coffee.
probably stick to the tea instead. Especially after 7 o'clock at night. So moving this on to sort of coming towards the end here, on a more of a sort of positive note, you said we're very early with this. What has the research given us any idea into potential treatments, or is it all about mitigation for most people at this point? Taking yourself out of those situations we mentioned, which is not ideal in a lot of places. Earplugs, these kind of things. Is there anything on the horizon as to how people might deal with this, or any interventions that might be fruitful, or is it too early to say?
So the same guy, Pavel Yastrobov, created a whole tinnitus retraining therapy approach, which he broadly construed to be applicable to other sound tolerance disorders. That has met with mixed success. Of course, he's going to say it's wonderful, and the published literature is lukewarm on its support, and a very recent publication. Again, this is specifically to tinnitus, so it might be more applicable for other disorders. Was essentially it wasn't any more effective in a very large 20-year-long study. It was not any more effective than sort of counseling and general, audiologist intervention type of stuff. That's very negative. I don't. So what I want to say is we need to move on from that kind of stuff, and the best way to do that is of course informed by brain mechanisms. And had I only been a co-author on the paper that I first described, in which we looked at the response of the anterior insula, then I might have still said, well, it's really unclear what would be the brain target. I mean, while that would be a natural brain target, that's sort of a generic one for, as I mentioned, monitoring internal states. And we're not going to turn that off in someone. And we might try and modify it with sort of biofeedback training and things like this, but these have also met largely with little or minimal success for many issues. But I think with this more second paper that we've published very recently, if we're couching things in terms of a motor system involvement, then we do have very, very particular brain regions to target and treatments potentially to offer with respect to the motor system, and whether it be still just a behavioral type of approach, or a desensitization type of approach, or indeed sort of a targeting with brain stimulation. I work in a department of neurosurgery here, and we do that a lot. Deep brain stimulation as a treatment for Parkinson's is wonderful. It's rather invasive, of course, but the trade-off is pretty good. I don't think we're anywhere near that for even things like tinnitus and misophonia. But if there are ways that we can start to do stimulation research targeting particular brain regions, then that might help us in terms of then using a less invasive form of stimulation, which of course is readily available to us. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, often used for medically refractory depression. So this is a safe and effective form of treatment, and that could yet be on the horizon.
So as we understand more about the parts of the brain that are involved in this, we can start to focus in on what potential treatments are interesting and potentially fruitful. So we're moving in the right direction, basically. As we learn more, we can start to focus down. Very good. So that's a nice positive note as we come towards the end for potential sufferers of this condition. So to wrap up, where do we go from here? What does the next 5 years look like in the research of this condition and this topic, and what should we be looking to achieve, sort of going down the pipe?
So there's a wonderful research foundation, the Misophonia Research Fund, which gives out decent-sized grants to researchers with various proposals for scientific studies, and I think this is going to be very helpful in advancing what we know. And so I want to say that in terms of, it's often the case for sufferers, if you feel like you're the only one who knows about this and the only one who's talking about it, or maybe it's just only Phil is talking about it as well as the scientific community, that's not the most encouraging, but I think it is being actively researched. So I do want to get that message out.
I remember that was one of the most helpful things when I had an issue with Intrusive. I don't want to keep going back to talking about myself, but was going in and talking to someone and them saying, yeah, we had 5 guys who came in and said the exact same thing last week, and then you're like, actually, I'm as soon as I realized I was a sort of textbook case, it became very demystified, and I was like, oh, okay, fine, lots of people have dealt with this before, and I'll just get on with it and deal with it. So making it visible is a very positive step forward, I guess.
It absolutely is. And of course, things like, again, I go back to tinnitus here. It's a perfect example where for way too long, this thing was thought that, oh, you don't have this? One, you don't have it. And two, I'm the only person who has this because no one else is talking about it. So I'm not gonna talk about it. And as I said, if the medical community doesn't have this in any sort of formal manual that tells them it exists, then sadly
You're
it
like,
doesn't
oh,
exist.
there must be something wrong with me. I'm a bit odd,
Yeah,
and
so
yeah.
that's really really unfortunate, because if there's very little recognition there, then there's going to be very little recognition publicly as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
And yes, it is important for recognition to be out there, and I think it is saying something that at least the research community is starting to move on board, and I'm being unfair to the medical community entirely. There are people, but I'm not uncommonly receiving emails saying, my daughter has this problem, and we're going to the doctors, and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't know what to do for you. So, yeah, that more or less dismissive type of approach is not the best. But research is moving forward, and I think on the horizon is continued push, I think, in us trying to understand the sort of neurophysiological mechanisms. As I said, we need to understand this well to then directly translate to treatment approaches. Whether I'm not going to be an advocate for invasive approaches as of yet, but non-invasive ones, like I mentioned already with TMS or sort of behavioral therapy type of approaches. These are things that I think that will get some good positive mileage in the near future, and I know other colleagues are working on this. And if we understand more about, as we've mentioned before, how or in what ways this is a learned response, then we can try and quote unquote unlearn these types of responses. And I know of research and other colleagues that are trying to approach this. Very simply, if you have a negative association with a particular sound, an event, or with a particular visual stimulus, if you literally nowadays we can cut and paste and chop around it any way we want, right? If you take that particular sound clip and then associate it with balloons or rainbows or bunnies.
This was cuddly cats, and
it was bunnies that were cuddling each other. It made me laugh out loud when I saw it, but it was totally positive, right? Like it was a nice happy thing. If that gets some mileage, and it's a very, very simple approach, that could be done at home by anyone, like implementing it themselves. That is very much preferable to, and you mentioned as well, I think, to wearing the earplugs. That is not a good approach. And
it's not solving anything. It's just sort of pushing it down the pipe and muddling by as best you can.
Yeah, and that has been commonly and clinically for a long time, again, in cases of tinnitus or hyperacusis. If people are trying to avoid these types of situations, then ultimately that's not going to be the helpful way to go forward. And small or slow amounts of desensitization are going to be more in the positive category.
So where can, I'm going to finish now. Thank you so much for taking this time to discuss with me. I really appreciate it. I don't want to keep you for too long. So just to close up, final question, where can people keep up with the research that you're doing, what you're saying on this topic, and see what is coming along as we go into the future with this condition and this research? So
there are our websites that are good. There's the Misophonia Research Fund. I'm blanking on.
I can put these all down in the description, by the way, as well. So if you can't remember them now, you can always send them on.
I can pass them along. There's another sort of a private guy who's put something together in the U.S. There's also a UK organization. I think that's also decent. The only danger or worry about just random Google searches for this is running into snake oil salespeople and quick fixes types of approaches, and also the concern that if you are going to surround yourself with people who are catastrophically thinking about these things, that's not generally going to be so positive for you. It is positive to know that other people are suffering or have the same issues, but it might just be that the recognition of that is enough, and instead it's going to be more positive looking at the research and how things are moving forward. And I can pass those links on. Yeah.
Please do. I'll put those down in the description, so head over there and have a look. Dr. Gander, thank you so much for taking the time today to discuss that with me. I've learnt a lot. I'm sure the people who are watching have learnt a lot. And hopefully we can have a chat again when the next research comes along.
Yeah, happily. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for taking time. Have a wonderful afternoon and a lovely weekend.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye now.